In this lecture, we will have a look on developed agricultural societies of the ancient Near East, their economic activities, and the particular conditions under which agricultural production took place. We will start with an overview of the historical developments in the Near East, how they may have affected ancient agriculture, and which plant processing technologies become important during this time. We will have a look on ancient crops and water availability, which is studied through stable carbon isotope measurements on ancient grain. Although substantial contributions are available from ancient philology, archaeology, and the natural sciences on different aspects of ancient Near Eastern agriculture, no systematic overview has been published yet, which is partly due to the diversity of the sources and the methodological problems of interpreting these sources within a wider framework. The rich textual record of cuneiform tablets, mostly available from southern and northern Mesopotamia, which has been estimated to number more than 500,000 texts, covers a broad range of information related to agriculture that has not yet been systematically analyzed. Archaeobotanical publications comprise millions of seed records from Near Eastern sites. Local geoarchaeological studies, including geographic information system-based analysis of satellite imagery and modeling, have been published and helped with the identification of settlement and land use patterns as aspects of early economic systems in some few regions of the Near East. Additional independent methods such as stable carbon isotope analysis, which has been used for investigating water stress on crop plants during their grain filling period, can help verify these results. Synthesis of the different data sources after careful analysis of the methodological problems will provide more comprehensive results on ancient agriculture in the near future, which may be also of some relevance to issues of conservation of genetic resources in the Near East. With the establishment of domesticated species, agricultural technology became more and more important. Although cultural contacts and barter always played a role in human populations, the set of traded objects was more and more enriched for different kinds of products, crop species, and wood resources, particularly with the onset of the Bronze Age. Technologies that were developed already in early prehistory were increasingly intensified, systematized, and developed into handcrafts. Craftsmen's classes were enabled through increased surplus production and large-scale storage, and altogether were part of the developing stratification of societies. The city-states and empires of the Bronze and Iron Ages and their socio-political layout under numerous different kings cannot be discussed here in detail, but for those of you who are interested, I recommend the textbooks by Ackermann and Schwarz, 2003, Van de Mierop, 2003, or Nissen, 1999, to mention just a few. There is a massive amount of data on agricultural techniques in southern Mesopotamia from cuneiform texts, while information on agricultural production for a more extended region also derives from archaeological and archaeobotanical studies, as you can see in the map. After having considered the emergence of agriculture in one of the previous lectures, we will skip the extended period of the pottery Neolithic and directly switch to the late Chalcolithic Early Bronze Age transition, which is marked by the Uruk period of southern Mesopotamia. The Uruk period combines all attributes of increasingly complex societies, such as population growth and progressive social stratification, including the side effects of competition for resources and the need for institutionalized organs, coordinating the more and more complex processes within the society. The development of writing in form of pictograms supported the increasing complexity of administration. These developments were part of the urbanization process, which was naturally bound to increasing agricultural yields, which were particularly profitable in regions with developed irrigation systems. Geoarchaeology considerably contributes to our knowledge of how these systems functioned and could be maintained in the face of changing environments and increasing food demands from rising populations. The example in the lower left shows a map of southern Iraq with channels constructed in the Euphrates floodplains, along with major ancient cities. Please also note the dense pattern of smaller settlements along the channels, which are known from archaeological surveys in the region. 5 stages in the development of Mesopotamian irrigation systems can be discerned from their initial development in prehistoric times to their demise starting in later Islamic times. For a deeper insight into the geoarchaeological contribution to understand ancient landscapes, I recommend to read the textbook by Tony Wilkinson. As previously mentioned, irrigation technology was already advanced during the Uruk period, which certifies that the use and application of irrigation evolved over millennia well before the rise and development of the first cities in southern Mesopotamia. Absolute dating of canals is, however, difficult, as they have been continuously in use after construction throughout ancient history. It has to be noted that the irrigation techniques in southern Mesopotamia strongly differed from those of Upper Egypt due to the different seasonal water access. In Egypt, the main floods arrive in early spring, allowing for sowing directly after the flood ends. In southern Mesopotamia, in contrast, the floodplains of the Euphrates are filled only in early summer, at a time when the seedlings have already been developed into young and delicate plants, which need protection from the massive power of water. To cope with this problem, complex aspects of water technology in the construction of canal systems had to be addressed within larger collaborations of several settlements, followed by a systematic and intensive management. Particularly the fact that the maximum water levels of the Euphrates and Tigris are asynchronous to agricultural requirements, that is, low level during sowing time and high level during early growth of the plant, required meticulous coordination, which is why the profession of the Gugalum existed, which can be translated as the inspector of the canals. In relation with irrigation, also long-term problems evolved, such as salinization, which has also been investigated by some geoarchaeologists. With the beginning of the early Bronze Age, cities of various ranks evolved also in Upper Mesopotamia and Syria, although the type of city-states based on agricultural surplus only becomes evident from 2600 BC onward. The processes that started in the Chalcolithic period continued in the following early Bronze Age Jemet Nasr, that is between 3100 and 1900 BC, and during the early dynastic between 2900 and 2334 BC. The plough was developed and agricultural surplus was used for importing other goods into the south, such as construction wood and mineral resources, through long-distance trade. Trade of agricultural products such as olive oil and grape wine is well documented in cuneiform sources from the early Bronze Age onward. While single oil presses are known from the Mediterranean region during the Chalcolithic, they only become more frequent during the Early Bronze Age. Agricultural surplus production was regionally intensified by focusing on few crop species with reliable yields, such as barley, which was a main crop in many northern Mesopotamian sites. The broad spectrum of crops observed since the Neolithic was, however, still cultivated, but barley became the most abundant cereal crop during the Early Bronze Age. Free-threshing wheat was cultivated particularly in inland settlements, while emmer wheat was represented with higher proportions in the coastal regions. Particularly for the sites in the north, knowledge on ancient agriculture is well founded on bioarchaeological results. While in the drier south, irrigation was necessary to receive sufficient yields to support large populations, farming was mostly rain-fed in the north, although the water of the rivers Kabur and Euphrates could have been used occasionally for irrigation of specific crops, as is evident for later periods at the upper Euphrates. Textual evidence suggests that the central organization of the northern Mesopotamian city-state included the majority of the inhabitants and that agriculture was organized as collective labor, which would correspond to organizational forms in southern Mesopotamia. Redistribution of the communally harvested crops according to status seems to have been the rule. For southern cities, very detailed information on the organization of crop and animal husbandry, including administrative management, is available from textual records. As taxation could have been a problematic burden, particularly in years with crop failures, the economic relation to the north and other regions for subsidizing were a significant political aspect. Increasing population pressure, particularly in the south, is considered to have provoked competition for resources between different city-states during the early dynastic period, which was accompanied by developing dynasties and war. Without written evidence, we have only limited options to identify ancient trade. This is either through findings of shipwrecks, as the famous wreck of Uluburun on the southern Turkish coast, or is exotic plants, that is, plants that are not native to the region of their archaeobotanical discovery. They can, however, either represent precious foodstuff and raw materials, such as cedar wood, or they are non-native weeds. We already discussed the trade of olive oil and wine and the import of exotic species in previous lectures, but I would like to summarize here again some aspects relevant to the archaeological evidence. We also heard previously that with simple length-width measurements of grape pips, a distinction of wild and cultivated grape is problematic due to intraspecific variability. However, with more complex morphometric measurements, combined with multivariate statistics, some researchers can even distinguish between cultivars of domesticated species. Such methods are particularly relevant in the investigation of long-distance trade relations. A more indirect proof of imported plants comes from wild plants that may have accompanied the crop species as weeds or entered the archaeobotanical record after having been used. For example, the appearance of celery or melissa in Neolithic sites of the Alpine foreland is an evidence for trade with Mediterranean populations, as both species are not native to more northern regions. Similarly, the appearance of the wheat species Silene cretica, together with flax in Central European Neolithic sites, indicates that it must have been introduced with the Neolithic crop dispersal from the Near East. Proving ancient plant remains to be of long-distance origin is a problematic issue and requires enormous knowledge of historical geobotany and experience in plant identification. Preservation conditions for such a task are generally only sufficient in wet preserved seeds. Since most genera are cosmopolite, that is, they occur with different species all over the world, the arguing for introduction of particular weed species from somewhere else requires morphological identification to the species level. Shortly before the end of the Early Bronze Age, the Akkadian Empire, between 2300 and 2100 BC, becomes dominant in the whole region of southern and northern Mesopotamia and beyond. In the south, the third dynasty of Ur came into power in the 21st century BC for a short time. Involved into diverse warfare accompanied by famine, it came to an end around 2004 BC. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire at the end of the Early Bronze Age has frequently been related with the Holocene climatic fluctuation of 4200 BP. It corroborates the geoarchaeological record in the region, indicating a distinct change in the regime of water streams from relatively stable, moderately strong water flows to increasingly rare, erratic, and stronger flows, which suggests increasing aridity. As large-scale environmental change is generally related to bottlenecks in agricultural production and accompanied by migration, upheaval, raids, and war, these may all have contributed to the collapse of the empire. The 4.2 BP event is also reflected in archaeobotanical barley from the Near East. It shows increased drought stress in the second half of the Early Bronze Age. The pictures show the stable carbon isotope measurements in barley at different sites. The 4.2 BP event is the red column labeled with the number 1. The drop of the values below the red line indicates drought stress experienced by the plants during their living time. Extended drought may have also strongly affected agricultural production. We will consider these aspects further down the road. During the Middle Bronze Age, the major empires of Babylonia, the foundation of the nomadic Amorite dynasties located in southern Mesopotamia, the old Assyrian Empire in the area of the upper Tigris River in northern Mesopotamia, and the Hittites were controlling the Near East, probably with a certain continuity of economic interests that already existed during the Early Bronze Age. The political history of the Middle Bronze Age empires is well documented in ancient texts, and there is equally comprehensive information on agricultural organization in the Middle Euphrates region and crop products in the Hittite area of influence in central Anatolia. The cuneiform texts indicate a high diversity of Hittite food plants. Beside the typical species that are found in Mesopotamia and the Levant, the Hittites consumed also crop species which either were no longer cultivated in the Near East, such as einkorn, and also crops that were never or only much later of importance in the wider region, such as spelt or millet. The broad cereal spectrum underlines the importance of this food category in Hittite economy. Cereals were not only used for the different types of bread indicated by a high diversity of names describing the different types of bread, but also for beer brewing. An important technology with probably prehistoric roots is fermentation, that is, the enzymatic transformation of organic substances, as in producing cheese from milk or beer from cereals. Beer production is known from ancient Egypt iconography and from heighted text tablets, and required the knowledge of specific techniques. In case of beer production, the malting of cereals, that is, bringing them to germinate, was necessary in order to produce the enzymes that would support fermentation. During germination, starch stored in the grain is transformed into malt sugar. As soon as the embryo has reached the length of the grain, germination is stopped through drying or careful roasting. Malted grains are relatively easy to recognize due to impressions on the grain left by the growing embryo. Archaeobotanical finds of malted grain represent accidents during roasting, that is, the roasting went into charring of the grains. During the Middle Bronze Age, some regions show a reduction of some of the crops with higher water requirements, which can be interpreted as a shift in agricultural production toward more drought-resistant species as a consequence of increasing aridity with the end of the early Bronze Age. In most of the Syrian archaeological sites, drought-tolerant barley is the main crop. In some cities, such as Mari at the Middle Euphrates, the lack of manpower for cultivating the fields was a problem during the Middle Bronze Age and led to local underproduction, which forced the palace to acquire barley on the market. For Babylonia, there is no indication of economic decline in the first 3 centuries of the second millennium, although in the north political conflict and continuous change of political regimes and economic structures seem to have been the rule during the Middle Bronze Age. The Late Bronze Age saw a number of different competing kingdoms and powers, expanding and retreating in the different geographic areas of the Fertile Crescent, which probably had its effect on agricultural economy. For details on the political and cultural history, I would like to refer you again to Nissen or one of the other textbooks mentioned before. Material culture and the continuation of important empires such as the Hurrians and Hittites suggest an even transition to the Late Bronze Age. Egypt was also strongly represented, particularly in the area of modern Syria. Overseas trade played an increasing role and was a sign of and a means for the international character of a large number of territorial states, shaping agricultural production for specific needs such as olive oil and wine. The end of the Bronze Age has often been explained as a consequence of the putative invasion of the Sea Peoples. Aside from political conflicts, economic decline has been proposed as a reason for the collapse of the Late Bronze Age civilizations, as well as a climatic impact, Bond Event number 2 respectively. The global cooling event between 1200 and 700 BC corresponds well with the stable oxygen isotope data from Lake Van, and thus might have had an impact on Near Eastern agriculture. The climatic reasoning has also been discussed in the literature before as the 1200 BC hypothesis of increased aridity, supported by archaeoclimatological models. Similarly, Rowling and others have suggested that the cooling period at the end of the Late Bronze Age adversely affected the agricultural quality in the northern and northeastern regions of the Aegean, thus triggering end of Bronze Age migrations. Others, like Eric Klein, have linked the time to extreme political upheaval. Most likely, complex interactions between political and ecological factors were reasonable for these massive supra-regional changes. Complete restructuring of the society must have taken place due to large-scale nomadization, migration, internal population movements, as well as changes in the technology and trade networks. How these changes influenced agricultural organization is still unclear. With the beginning of the first millennium BC, the political situation in the Near East had become more stable, and a new network of states arose, which becomes tangible in the 9th century BC by written records again. Iron Age Syria has been characterized as a region of numerous small states, which was absorbed into the provincial systems of vast multi-regional empires. The generally broadening network of commercial connections doubtlessly had an influence on agricultural production. Agricultural organization during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which embraced practically the whole Near East, was the planned distribution of rural labor forces, the installation of large-scale irrigation systems, and a centralized program for rural land settlement policy. Agricultural surplus was also possible due to a dense rural population. New crops appeared in the archaeobotanical assemblages, such as cotton, pomegranate, and cucumber, most of them requiring irrigation in areas of irregular and low rainfall. This corroborates the importance of irrigation as is evident from the texts. Changes in persisting crop species are particularly visible in free-threshing wheat and grape ubiquities, which occur generally more often in the archaeobotanical record of the Iron Age, and which are confirmed by the textual evidence of numerous vineyards in northern Mesopotamia. The larger body of textual evidence from the first millennium also reveals more linen textiles than in the second millennium. Flax for linen production required additional irrigation. Still, the textual evidence is almost exclusively for the import of linen as tribute from Syria to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Only later, during the Neo-Babylonian period, do we find evidence for more frequent linen cultivation. The use of flax fiber production was probably accompanied by the development of more and more sophisticated fiber production technologies. Simpler technologies were already known in prehistory and, as we saw in the previous lectures, to some degree already in the Paleolithic. The slide shows the traditional working steps required for making flax suitable for textile production. The production of linen fiber is a multi-step procedure and takes several weeks, starting with the drying of the flax harvest to strengthen the fibers. After drying, the capsules will be removed through beading or riffling. The latter is conducted with the help of a comb-type instrument. The next step is redding, which is usually conducted in an artificial pond. This results in solution of pectin through bacteria to smoothen the fiber and is followed by another drying process. After drying, the stalks are further processed by breaking to get rid of the lignified parts. Breaking is traditionally done with a specific instrument you can see in the picture on the upper right of the slide. Scotching, that includes beading and combing, releases the remaining lignified parts, and the final heckling, for which again a comb is used, results in fibers that can be spun into threads. Flax textiles and also the required tools for fiber production can be found under exceptional preservation conditions. Since many of the tools were made from wood and other organic materials, they preserve under waterlogged conditions as in settlements in the alpine forelands. As we just saw, linen production becomes particularly prominent in the Iron Age Near East and in the Levant in particular, possibly related to Egyptian requirements. We will hear more about this in one of the presentations to follow. In relation with textiles, clothes, and costumes, colors became more and more important and even indicated status. Therefore, trade of pigments developed, best evidence in the meaning of the seafaring people's name of the Phoenicians, which stands for a purple dye extracted from murex snails. There's generally only limited direct evidence for dyeing with plant material, because usually the vegetative parts are used, which decay easily and preserve only under waterlogged conditions. Some findings derive from European Iron Age contexts, but most of them are from medieval excavations, such as finds of Genista tinctoria at York, where stark fragments of the plants were found in the possible context with sheep wool dyeing. Possible colors that can be produced by Genista cover a range of yellow, olive, green, and brown. Another species is Isatis tinctoria that produces blue colors. Actually, that both plants share the same species name is no accident, as tinctoria refers to Latin tingere and translates as dyeing. The production of color from plants is in most cases a multi-step process and also requires fermentation of the crushed plant material, and in most cases the addition of mineral components to extract the color. In the relation with trade, the archaeology of seafaring people, such as the Phoenicians, is a major field in Mediterranean archaeology. Their nutritional subsistence, however, is not well understood. Despite the fact that there is plentiful evidence in archaeology on ancient economic systems and relations, there is little known on the agricultural maintenance of many important cultural entities, because the rural populations and life strategies of everyday life are generally not reflected in ancient texts, which, however, provide a major information source on ancient political relations. Archaeobotany in Bronze and Iron Age settlements and royal cities aims to fill this gap and has enriched our understanding of the functional base frame of ancient societies. We will get some information on the achievements of this research in an upcoming presentation. Here I would like to present an example that still requires major input from archaeobotanical research to be fully understood: the Phoenicians, Bronze Age seafaring merchants of the Mediterranean. Much of the current knowledge on the agricultural aspects in the Phoenician context is based on ancient historical sources, that is, on Greek and Roman texts. There it is stated that they established a thriving agricultural production, disposed of a highly regarded agrarian expertise, and were ruthless in exploiting rural resources. Such statements contrast heavily with the available evidence from archaeobotany and zooarchaeology, which exists only in a very patchy form. The material basis is that only a small number of rural settlements is located in direct vicinity of the Western Phoenician settlements in the 7th century BC, which may be interpreted as a sign of a limited number of inhabitants, which according to Van Dommelen would be related with chronic labor shortages. This would have undermined agricultural surplus production. Only in the 6th and 5th century BC population increased, and the provisioning situation probably changed. It is also unclear how far the indigenous inhabitants of the Circum-Mediterranean have supplied the labor required for agricultural expansion of particularly wine and oil production. This is related to the fact that it is often unclear whether rural settlements were of Phoenician colonizers or of indigenous Iron Age farmers who eventually may have also maintained some kind of trading with other settlements. Although archaeologists discuss Phoenician trade of wine and olive oil, they hardly ever refer to any of the existing archaeobotanical works. Considering the archaeobotanically relatively well investigated Levant, the virtual absence of archaeobotanical investigations on Phoenician sites is striking. Only from Sidon one piece of wood has been submitted for botanical identification. Therefore, we have practically no understanding of whether Phoenician heartland towns maintained their own agriculture or whether they somehow extracted their food bases from the settlements in the hinterlands. Considering the agricultural remains of sites in close vicinity to the Phoenician sites, we see relatively diverse patterns which are partially due to the limited scale of the investigations. In general, small-scale analysis, as in the case of Tel Kiri, where the results are based on only 45 seed remains, cannot be considered as representative for the agricultural economy at the site. Another aspect that always needs to be borne in mind is the steep climate geographic gradients of this region to the east and south, which, for example, may be responsible for different proportions in free-threshing wheat and barley. Another explanation of the very variable crop assemblages could be a highly structured supra-regional production system that relied on a monocrop surplus production in specific regions. Without investigation in the Phoenician heartland, such explanations remain hypothetical. The archaeobotanical research situation also applies to some other regions of the Phoenician sphere of influence, such as the Iberian Peninsula. This is just one example to show that despite an impressive history of archaeobotanical research in the Near East, there are still archaeological research questions that did not attract particular attention to archaeobiologists and that are waiting to be resolved by trained archaeobotanists in the future. The historical thriving and demise of major states is a major research field of Near Eastern archaeology, and numerous studies have been conducted to better understand the reasons for such developments. Since Aristotle's introduction of the causal reasoning and the relation between a prime mover resulting in a concrete end result, researchers addressed the question of societal collapses by applying some form of causal determinism. In most cases, the search for causality was either directed toward an environmental or climatic determinism, or it was culturally or socially deterministic. Only during the past few decades, researchers more and more implemented multiple causes, feedback mechanisms, and reciprocal amplification as parameters and agents into cause and effect models that developed into infinite multi-causal networks of events. One of the first authors popularizing and summarizing this topic was Jared Diamond, who was frequently criticized but finally must be congratulated to have been one of the few scientists having the ability to present complex topics in a way to awaken a broad audience. The largest problems opposed to sustainability of complex societies are a matter of common knowledge and have been vividly summarized by Diamond in his book Collapse as Mismanagement and Wrong Decisions. These are failing to conceive a problem before it becomes critical, for example, the extended Iron Age deforestation in northern Mesopotamia by the Assyrians, leading to hydrological problems and soil erosion. Another point is failing to recognize serious problems because of gradual aggravation. Another one, rational bad behavior due to conflicts of interest, as for example self-enrichment of the so-called elites. And finally, irrational behavior through disastrous values, such as extremist devoutness. Archaeobotany cannot contribute much to the human component of perception, whereas the study of plant remains provides an insight into environmental conditions and human action on natural systems. We already heard about Bond events and also about some of the major paleoclimate archives in the Near East in one of the previous lectures. We also learned that certain cultural transitional phases in the past may have been associated with strong climatic fluctuations. As an example, I would like to focus here on the 4.2 BP event. This condensed overview lists some research works that present such climatic fluctuations around this time. One of the most prominent local paleoclimate records is the stable isotope evidence in the speleothems of Sori Cave in Israel that indicates a strong shift to increasing aridity starting around 4.2 BP, that is, from the end of the early Bronze Age continuing well into the Middle Bronze Age. Apart from such local records, the reasons for these regional climate effects can be traced in the global paleoclimate record. For example, isotopic analysis of ice cores show that Atlantic subpolar and subtropical surface waters cooled by 1 to 2 degrees. Demenokal and colleagues could demonstrate by an analysis of the modern instrumental record that large interannual reductions in Mesopotamian water supply result when subpolar Northwest Atlantic Sea surface temperatures are anomalously cool. This may have been the case between 2500 and 2300 BC, when Icelandic cores show cooling, which represents Bond event number 3. Paleoclimate records alone, however, don't show us how human populations were affected by such climatic fluctuations, whereas most archaeological records cannot answer the question how far environmental change contributed to the collapse of city-states. Archaeobotanical data can contribute to answer this question by looking for changes in the wild plant and crop assemblages throughout time. As we have seen in one of the previous slides, the agronomic requirements of plants inform about general water requirements and environmental sensitivity of the plants. In considering large archaeobotanical datasets over extended geographic regions may help to find general patterns of fluctuations in plant assemblages. We may consider these datasets as they reflect the role of particular crops over an extended geographic region. The example shows the proportions of einkorn wheat in early Bronze Age sites on the left and the same crop during the Middle Bronze Age on the right. The empty circles indicate sites where the species was not found. We can do such comparison by looking at proportions, but as we learned in one of the first lectures, we also do this by considering ubiquities. As you can see with the example for grape. Of course, we can always argue that there may have been cultural reasons why a specific crop plant was no longer cultivated. However, since we can directly measure in the plant whether it was growing under stress conditions, we may either support or deny an environmental explanation for observed changes in crop assemblages. We do this by using stable carbon isotope analysis on a well-studied crop species, and I will shortly explain the principles. For more details, please go to the Ilias folder, literature/additional articles, and download some of the literature there. The fact that plants photosynthesize explains why they can fix carbon isotopes with their tissues. Since major plant groups, for example C3 and C4 plants, differ in their ways how they use CO2, they show specific ranges in their delta-13C contents. The picture also shows that the general abundance of 13C in plant material is smaller than in the atmospheric carbon, indicating that isotopic discrimination of carbon happens with the fixation of CO2 in the plant biomass. Variation in 13C, 12C ratios evolves through different fractionation of the different metabolic processes which are most relevant to photosynthesis. Farquhar published the main steps of isotopic fractionation already in 1989, showing the discrimination of each station of CO2. We can well imagine that changes in the environmental conditions can easily affect the different processes listed. Here a look on how atmospheric CO2 is fixed and reduced to saccharose. CO2 passes the stomata, is dissolved in water, and then enters the chloroplasts. The enzyme Rubisco produces a 6-carbon molecule, which it splits into 2 molecules with 3 carbon atoms. Without going into further detail, we can now have a look on how stress, for example in the form of drought, affects the plants. As we have already seen, carbon derives mainly from the air. Under balanced conditions, there is the same amount of CO2 inside the stomata as in the atmosphere. The enzyme Rubisco in C3 plants prefers to uptake 12C from CO2, that is, it is discriminating against C13, leading to a depletion of the heavy isotope. Under stress, through increased aridity, the plant reduces its stomatal conductance by closing the stomata to avoid dehydration. In this case, CO2 within the stomata decreases, and there is a relative increase to use 13C to maintain the metabolic processes. The differences in 13C, 12C ratios in subfossil plant remains can therefore be used to evaluate the stress the plant experienced during a specific life period. In the case of cereal grains, the stress during the grain filling period can be evaluated. Measuring a large number of barley grains from different sites, we can get an accumulated record of the stress signals of the plants during their grain filling periods. And as you can see here for the Middle Bronze Age, there is indeed increased drought stress in the plants during that time. We will hear more about this in an upcoming presentation, but I would also like to recommend to you to go to the ILIAS homepage and download some of the stable isotope articles you will find there.